Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also like to appreciate the opportunity of being in this forum with the distinguished chair and moderator, as well as the distinguished colleague participants. And I would like to thank Dr. Muhammad for a very nice perspective, which I think probably may be a new term, which is investment diversification, actually, which is, I think, is important, and the example of Kuwait actually present a very good case study for this kind of approach when opportunities because of geography or location might not allow, for example, a product differentiation, diversification, then there is the option of investment diversification. And I think this is a very important topic maybe that merits further research and analysis. And I would also think that to the extent that the neighborhood of Kuwait in the Middle East and the Arab world become also an area for investment by the Kuwaiti private sector, that would be another form of entrepreneurial kind of diversification as well, hopefully. I wanted actually to focus on one key issue, which is threshold of rent per capita. And actually this has been a subject of a paper that I contributed to, a book edited by Ahmed Jalal and Ishaq Dewan on the as one of the proceedings of the International Economic Association. And this is an issue that I think the ARF has already started to make some contribution on, and I think it holds a great potential to further analyze the issue, not only in terms of economic policy, but also in terms of institutions and how resource per capita, the threshold of resource per capita actually determine the political equilibrium that might actually explain the institution and the evolution of the institution. And the distinction between the high rent per capita countries, the GCC, but not confined to the GCC. I actually identified about 12 countries that include very diverse group of countries, such as Equatorial Guinea and Gabon in Africa, as well as Trinidad and Tobago in Latin America, and then of course the GCC, about 12 countries that actually stands out as on average have much better performance in terms of economic growth over about 10 to 13 years. They actually achieved a cumulative growth higher than the populous resource economies by about 13%. In addition, in terms of conflict, because if you think of any polity or political regime, it's supposed to deliver, to exercise control on organized violence and to deliver development. So the countries that has more than $2,000 in fixed US dollars, 2,000 US dollars, over the last 30 years or so, they on average experience, only 2 countries experience a civil war. And the duration of the civil war was about 20 years or less. While countries that has rent per capita between 200 and less than 2,000, they experience about 26 years of wars, and only 2 countries, so it's still not bad. Sorry, only 7 countries. But then if you go further, like for example, countries with rent per capita less than 200, there are 36 countries that experience civil wars for a duration of more than 40 years. So it is very clear that actually there is a pattern, and so the idea is to explain this pattern. And we try to, conceptualize this outcome by thinking of the social contract or the bargain between the incumbent regime and the population. So in countries which are endowed with very substantial resources and then relatively small population, so the rent per capita is so high that allowed these incumbent authorities to spread the rents much more widely and therefore generate a more stable political equilibrium and also more equitable political equilibrium as far as the nationals are concerned. And the GCC economies are that example. On the other hand, in societies which are populous, and so therefore rent per capita is not that high, the incumbent regimes, especially authoritarian incumbent regimes, they basically forge a social contract with a subset of the society, the military, the security, or the tribe or the community of the power that be, and therefore that social contract cannot be stable and is likely to be challenged through civil wars, and also the economic performance become problematic. So therefore, even though the received literature suggests that institutions that the resource scarce is a conditional phenomena and conditional on bad governance, both political and economic, but especially political. And this actually does explain very substantial experiences. I think one lacuna in the literature is to actually try to understand and explain the relatively superior performance of these few countries, set of countries, lucky countries like the GCC and a few others, despite, regardless of the type of the underlying political institutions. And I did some gross regressions in which, instead of using the measure of dependence, rents per capita over GDP, which is already being criticized. I know, for example, Michael Ross has done a great job in alerting us to the endogeneity problems of using rent per capita, and because of the the endogeneity, that rent per capita itself, there is a reverse causation. So in this regression that I used, where I used rent, that the critique was rent over GDP. So I used rent per capita and found that actually in a baseline model that does not control for institutions, the tipping point, there is a non-monotonic relationship between rents per capita and gross. And that actually, the tipping point for generating positive gross is over $1,800 per person. So this actually suggests that only a few countries, actually starting from Gabon, which has a rent per capita of 2,300, slightly above 2,300, and all the way to Qatar, which has currently the highest rent per capita. And these are the few countries that actually can grow unconditionally, regardless of the underlying institutions. The rest of the countries cannot grow or deploy the resource rents in a positive way to promote growth. But then once we extend the model and control for institutions, political or economic institutions, such as government effectiveness, the World Bank government effectiveness, or polity or political constraints, then the tipping point drops significantly and becomes $148 per person, which is roughly the rent per capita in South Africa. So it does suggest that actually institutions are very important, institutions matter, but then those highly endowed economies are likely to grow regardless of the underlying institutions. But then how could we explain the role of rents in forming or in influencing the institution? We found economic governments to be the answer, that actually these small countries, stable economies, stable societies that do not really experience civil war, they have a tendency to have a better management institutions. And once we introduce that factor, the non-monotonic effect disappears. We suggest that economic institutions are probably the outcome of that political equilibrium. I think to conclude, the issue that I think needs to be discussed is going forward. Is this political equilibrium likely to eventually lead to a more, politically open process so that in the long term you will have both political and economic inclusion, as Imoglu and Robinson suggest that studying the history of civilizations, nations that achieve inclusiveness on the economic side but fail to do it on the political or vice versa, did not really establish a stable equilibrium. So that's an issue for the discussion. Thank you.